Hey folks, as some of you may know from my earlier videos, I have a bit of a fondness for games that can kick my
asparagus.
And I'll admit, when I first took a glance at Passtech Games' dark action roguelite Curse of the Dead Gods, well, I got the distinct impression that it wasn't going to be a walk in the park. But did this wind up being the sort of challenge that left me spellbound? Or was Dead Gods simply cursed content? I'm your host Arlyeon, and let's find out together. Whether it's in the pursuit of knowledge, of long-lost riches, or even prestige and glory, the discovery of long-lost ruins holds a certain appeal. Unfortunately, there's little joy to be found in this expedition, as our intrepid explorer finds himself trapped within the bowels of these ancient temples, alongside their inhuman inhabitants. Worst of all, entry bore an especially steep price, as Manly McMutton Chops, name pending, now finds himself subject to the curse of the dead gods. Now marked with the attention of the death god Zabeltzalok, our protagonist finds himself locked in an agonizing cycle of dark demises and wretched rebirths, while doing his best to cling on to his humanity and escape. Anyways, with the intro done, it's likely to take you a while for you to discover more about your unfortunate circumstances, in large part because a lot of Curse's storytelling comes in the form of lore. Some of it's found in the flavor texts on weapons, as well as the accessories you accrue, but the vast majority of it is contained within the bestiary. And filling that out requires a certain degree of prowess on the player's part. Still, I ultimately came away feeling the process of garnering that knowledge was a legitimately worthwhile endeavor, since there's a lot contained within those entries. For one thing, they provide some altogether disconcerting details about your adversaries, as well as the dead deities which once served as their patrons. Like, you will wind up with a decent bit of insight into just how terrible the temple is once you've been given a few examples of how the gods chose to bless, heavy fucking air quotes, their faithful. That said, another key reason I found myself invested in the bestiary was that it represented the central way we get to learn about our protagonist. Each entry is written from his point of view, and allows to see the gradual toll the temple and his dread miracles take on him. Whether it's shards of sympathy for its long-fallen faithful, or existential musings on just what damage is being done by his continual deaths, you get a decent look at the man and the stubbornness which drives him forward. The flavor text found at the bottom of the pages are also pretty neat, given they more or less follow the experiences of a few other explorers, and provide a surprisingly decent bit of narrative accompaniment once you've read and pieced them all together. Really, all of that was actually why I found myself driven to continue pushing forward after I reached the game's first ending, as whilst it was fitting enough, I definitely wanted to know more. And goddamn, the game's true ending is definitely a doozy. Seriously, the revelations that come with the final lore page are just damn. It just took a while to get there because it required getting to the end of the very final, very hard expedition. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so now's as good a time as any to transition over to gameplay. Now, like I've said, and like you've been seeing, Curse of the Dead Gods is an action roguelite, albeit one with some very distinct mechanics. A lot of which are going to be combat-centric, not going to lie. So first off, there's definitely a deliberate element in Curse's fights, which is to say, you're going to die if you mash buttons, given there's a stamina system at play. Now, this not only limits how often you can dodge consecutively, but also plays a part in managing your offensive options, specifically since the finishing and charge hits drain stamina, as do all heavy weapons at large. Thankfully, you don't just have to wait on stamina to replenish, since killing enemies and perfect dodging also serves to restore it, allowing for combat to flow if you manage your options skillfully. That, or you can just throw caution to the wind and learn how to parry. Does this occasionally result in me eating a spear to the face? Yeah, but, parrying replenishes heaps of stamina, staggers everything, even bosses, and causes them to take extra damage, and it just really feels good to pull off, not even gonna front. Honestly, I can say the same thing about combat at large, really. Whilst it took me a little bit to get used to it, once I got the groove of using the main and offhand weapons properly, I wound up discovering that they had a lot to offer, especially because while they both have fully functional movesets of their own, offhand weapons also have abilities which are specifically triggered by using them in the midst of main hand combos. And this gets really interesting when you factor in just how many diverse types of main and offhand weapons there are, allowing for different synergies. Want to parry easier? Sure, you can use a shield. But want to abuse the offhand knive's backstab abilities? Use a claw, since it can teleport you behind an enemy faster than you can say, "Nothing personal, kid." And this is compounded further when you get the elemental weapons, given that while the status effects in the game are interesting enough by default, they have altogether satisfying interactions with each other. So if you blade an enemy that's already suffering from an elemental ailment, you can expect some explosive results. That said, as much as there's a lot of fun to be had with that, I've likely spent most of my time wielding two-handed weapons. Sure, they burn stamina with every swing or shot, but there's really neat options, like spears which auto-crit if you hit with just the tip. Just the tip! Or the glory of stun-locking things with heavy weapons, which can break walls too. And, you know, that helps a lot, since I forsake my dinky torch and just run around in pitch darkness, because, yes, to engage in combat, you need to put away your torch, unless you intend on just bapping and burning your opposition to death. Which, doable, technically. Unfortunately, fighting in darkness means you take extra damage, traps become invisible, and you'll fail to see if walls are cracked. So it does behoove you to light braziers when possible, or enemies. Look, they're both very flammable. Still, that's far from the only tactical decision you'll need to muster. To progress to the dead god's tomb, you'll need to navigate a series of temples, each with their own distinct death traps, enemies, and bosses. Now, I personally dreaded my time in the Eagle Temple versus the other two, so I was incredibly grateful that I was able to choose which areas to tackle. Sure, I had to do them all, but I could push things off till later when I felt prepared. And then you reach the Mixed Temple, where you're put through an extra long gauntlet that involves all three temples combined. It's a doozy, especially given the game's corruption mechanic. See, when you engage in an expedition, you're left to chart out your paths across the rooms, doing your best to get the upgrades you need before you face the boss. That said, with every room completed, you accrue corruption, which could also be inflicted by certain enemy attacks, or just by greed if you're running short on gold but still want to buy something from the shop. Let it get to 100 and you're given a curse, a lasting debuff that can vastly alter the gameplay. The thing is, the majority of these also have interesting upsides, making them dangerous, but actually lending themselves to synergizing with some builds. Enemies turning into living bombs is dangerous to you, sure, but also their peers. Your torch being unable to light things up sucks, but significantly less when you don't take extra damage in darkness. Then you get to the fifth and final curse, which devours your health at a rapid rate, and you are left cursing your hubris for embracing the earlier ones. Thankfully, you can shed curses by clearing bosses, but it's generally safer to try and mitigate corruption if you can. Especially once you clear the game and unlock hard mode, because yes, that's a thing, and not only is the overall ferocity of your foes amped, and then again with each step further into the hard expeditions, you'll also find yourself navigating some pretty harsh corruption modifiers in the very final expedition. Still, it's pretty rewarding, even just to flounder and fail, given that I did call this game a roguelite for a reason. There's a few elements of permanent progression and character building that you can play with, courtesy of the crystal skulls you encounter during your run, and the jade rings that bosses drop. Jade rings are simple enough. They're strictly used to unlock different weapons for you to find and to start with. Though, you'll need to do a bit of extra legwork for boss weapons, a set of unique cursed weapons, which require you to do certain actions during a boss fight, like parrying the crap out of one, or killing it while it's on fire. Weirdly, these actions are actually never specified during the game, and given they also have a 25% drop rate even if you fulfill them, it might take you some time to encounter one of these unless you look up how to do it. Nonetheless, they're generally pretty neat, though I often felt they paled in comparison to some of their non-cursed companions. Titan Slayer. Warmonger's Claws. Ahem. Skulls, on the other hand, are used for basically everything else. Want to have a variety of weapon benches? You can have choices for what kind of weapon to bring into a run? Crystal Skulls. Want to upgrade the overall rarity of said weapons and to be able to start with heavy weapons? Crystal Skulls. Want to re-roll the options you're given at shops? That's Defying Favor, which is also gained with Crystal Skulls. And then there's the blessings. As you progress to the temples, you'll gradually unlock the ability to buy these. Crystal Skulls. and can ultimately equip up to 3 of them. What's really neat about these is that they can genuinely change how a run goes drastically. Tamok's Bones, for instance, gives you a permanent bonus to your constitution, which manages health and warmonger damage, and then further boosts it every time you finish a room under half health. Grace of the Tempest, on the other hand, rewards flawlessness. Every time you clear a room without getting hit, you gain a point of dexterity, which manages your damage. And there's even synergies between some of these, such as the blessing that actually reduces damage you take while you're in light and extends how far your light goes, and another blessing which has a chance of turning non-elemental damage to fire damage, causing you to light people on fire and light up the room. I honestly just really love these, and as I got more comfortable with the game, I began to experiment around with them a lot more, especially as I deviated from a more tried and true weapons. Plus, it helped me tackle some of the daily event missions, which, whilst I generally find these easier than the hard mode expeditions, they're still challenging all the same, especially given they put you under the influence of some interesting effects, such as permanent curses or even more unique afflictions, all stacked together to provide an experience you won't generally encounter in your traditional runs. And hey, they offer bonus crystal skulls, so I won't be surprised if editors made a counter at this point because of just how many fucking times I've said crystal skulls. Anyways, with all that said, now's as good a time as any to talk aesthetics. And, you know, I have to say, I really dig Curse of the Dead God's art style. The dark, gritty elements of the character design is just lovely to see, whether it's the character models for the protagonist or his enemies, to the artwork that you can unlock in the bestiary. The color variants do take a while though, given they require you to repeatedly slay their intended target perfectly when they're elites, or just perfectly slaying the bosses, which, oof. And I genuinely appreciated how diverse each of the biomes appeared, both from each other as well as the ways in which they change up the further you get into a run. It's some legitimately good stuff. And then topping all that off is just the gorgeous lighting cues. This was actually taken aback by how different the temple's vibe is when plunged into darkness, especially given how nightmarish some enemies look when they're skulking in the shadows. I have a fair amount of praise for the game's music, too, given it never wore down on me over the course of my myriad playthroughs. Then again, it does help that all the temple types have their own themes, as do each of their champions and bosses, providing a decent bit of diversity. Frankly, the only thing that galled me at all was the horrible baby squalls that the dreadful offspring enemy emit. Seriously. Get into a room with a handful of them and it's just disconcerting baby noises, lightning sounds, and a whole lot of suffering. But, you know what? It's fine. It's fine. We've now arrived at the conclusion, so I can just outright say it. Even the unholy cacophony of thunderous tantrums and squealing squalls? Those couldn't curb my enthusiasm for this game. Even when I didn't have that much available to me as offensive options, I still found myself fond of the combat. I thrilled at the feeling of crushing bosses that once beat me, even as I grew increasingly fascinated by the bits of story that unfurled in my blood-stained bestiary. And then I actually started making progress in leaps and bounds, and the magic really started happening. Diverse arrays of ornaments lay sprawled before me before each run, alongside the blighted blessings of the gods. It was about that point I basically devoted myself to trying to beat everything the game had to offer, except perfecting all of the bosses 10 times. Haha, no. Even now, I still poke into it whether to try a daily event I haven't seen or beaten yet, or just for satisfaction's sake. And that's really telling. Overall, I'd say that this game is a crit hit in my book. It's genuinely satisfying, and even after having seen the true ending, I still found myself spending hours on it and learning new things. And that's fucking fantastic. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, or gaming content, you can hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description, so you can become part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, or badger me to play different games that you think I might enjoy. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.